Learning Kubernetes can be a daunting task for new engineers. How many times have you come across YAML syntax errors, out of memory errors, crash loop backoff, pod pending status, pod restarting all the time, and more? Now, many of these issues can occur because Kubernetes is very open-ended and flexible. Kubernetes provides the building blocks to build out our containerized infrastructure, meaning that you can install anything from complex Helm charts, customized templates, and lots of YAML files. And Kubernetes does not have the built-in guardrails to catch misconfigurations. Now, this includes everything from the basics such as YAML syntax error, all the way to ensuring your pods have memory limits and CPU limits as well as health probes. Now, even advanced things like ensuring your containers don't run with root capabilities. This is where Datree comes in. Datree is a free and open source utility that combats misconfigurations, so engineers can focus on important things like building apps for customers. Datree is very easy to install, and you get immediate feedback by running Datree test against your YAML files. It checks for YAML syntax errors, it checks for Kubernetes schema, and does policy checks against your manifests. Datree can test every part of your workflow on your local machine, in your CI/CD pipelines during deployment, and even test your production environments. Now, if you think about the times when production issues occur, you have ops or platform engineers trying to figure out why the system is misbehaving. Or you have development teams who are noticing errors and trying to figure out what the problem is. And many times the people troubleshooting will involve more senior folks or even pull in more development teams to help troubleshoot the problem. Now think about the costs and salaries of all these people. All these people could be doing more productive things somewhere else. This is why there is such a popular theory and theme, which is called shifting left, finding problems as early as possible, which saves cost. Now, this could be something as very simple as finding a YAML syntax error on your local, or it could be something more advanced, like a memory leak of an application. An application runs out of memory and potentially starves other applications on the same infrastructure, causing customer impact. This can be really costly to troubleshoot. Now, Datree helps us put in place some guardrails to try to protect against these issues, all the way from localhost through to production. Today we're doing a deep dive into Datree. So without further ado, let's go. So if we take a look at my GitHub repo, I have a Kubernetes folder, and in the Kubernetes folder we have a Datree folder with a README. And this is our introduction to Datree. This is going to show us how to install Datree and go through all the features. So be sure to check out the link down below to the source code so you can follow along. Now, to get started with Datree, the best place to start is the documentation. If you head over to hub.datree.io, you can see the getting started page with all the instructions, and it's very simple to dive into all the features on the left hand here. Now, installing Datree is very simple. On the quick start guide, there's a way to install it using the automated install by simply running this curl command. We can also download the binaries from the GitHub release page. Now, as you probably know, I like to do all my work in lightweight Docker containers. It's useful for testing and it makes it easy for you to reproduce. So what I'm going to do is run a lightweight Alpine container and do all the tutorial stuff from within the container. I'm going to say docker run -IT for interactive. I'm going to mount all the source code into the container. I'm also going to mount my Kubernetes kubeconfig file, the default location for the kubeconfig file. I'm going to mount that into the container as well. I'm going to set my working directory to work. I'm going to give my container host networking, and I'm just going to run a small Alpine container in a shell terminal. I'm going to go ahead and run that, and now I'm inside of a container, and if I type ls, you can see all the source code on the left here is inside of the container. Now next up, because Alpine is very lean, it doesn't have much installed, so I'm going to install some dependencies. I'm going to say apk add. I'm going to add curl because I don't have curl here, and I'm going to use curl to do the automated installation and pull down Datree. I'm going to use unzip so that we can unzip Datree. I'm also going to install bash and sudo, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. So I go ahead and install these dependencies, and now we can go ahead and install Datree. And there are two ways we can do this. The automatic installation, which is the simplest way. I can simply say curl, and the URL I pass in is getdatree.io and pipe it to bin bash. So I go ahead and run that. That'll go ahead and install the Datree command line utility. And now you can see it printed out how to run it. So we can simply say Datree test and point it to our YAML file. Very simple. An alternative way is to head over to GitHub, go to the Datree.io Datree repository, and this is all the source code for Datree on GitHub. To get Datree, on the right hand side here, we can go to the releases page, and we can simply download the binary from here and unzip it. Now in this demo, I'm downloading 1.5.20, so I'm saying curl -L, and I pull down this binary, the zip file, and I just pull it to a temp folder here. I go ahead and run that. That'll download it to a temp directory, and then I'm going to run this command. This simply unzips that zip file into the temp directory, gives the executable chmod permission so it can execute, and move it to user local bin. So just go ahead and run that, and that's the manual way to install Datree. If I run the Datree command, we can see now we have access to the Datree command line utility. Now the cool thing about Datree is that it immediately adds value from the moment you download that binary, without even touching your Kubernetes clusters. Now the first very useful feature of Datree is YAML validation. Suppose I have an example deployment. Under my Kubernetes Datree folder, I have an example folder with a deployment.yaml. This is a basic Kubernetes deployment with 2 pods, as you can see here. Now the first struggle that engineers have is making sure the YAML has valid syntax. Let's say, for example, I break the syntax over here. We can test the YAML by running Datree test against that example YAML file. So it's only one command you need to learn, Datree test followed by the path to the file. I go ahead and run that. You can see it immediately does YAML validation and returns an error saying that there's a problem on line 11. The second really useful feature of Datree is Kubernetes schema validation. This lets us know if our Kubernetes YAML file works for a given version of Kubernetes. Let's say I have a Kubernetes YAML file that works on a Kubernetes 1.20 cluster, and I'm planning on upgrading my Kubernetes cluster to 1.24. I can use Datree to test my YAML to make sure it's compatible with the new version. We'll dive into that in a bit. Now the third feature of Datree is policy checks. You can see if we run Datree test against our YAML again, after we fixed up the YAML syntax, it's now passing. However, the policy checks are now failing. Now Datree comes with a whole bunch of predefined rules, which we can combine together to form a policy. We can go ahead and customize these rules and also combine all these rules to form a custom policy. We can create a policy for a dev environment that might have less restrictions. We can have a separate policy for staging and production, which has more stricter rules. So to give you some example of what rules are, have a look here. So we can define rules like ensure a container has a CPU limit, ensure containers have configured CPU requests, ensure containers have liveliness probes. We can do things like set memory limit rules and memory request rules, as well as readiness probes. So this helps us put in place restrictions to ensure that our Kubernetes YAML follows best practices. So this could prevent a pod with a memory leak from causing heavy disruptions in our production cluster. Now I can also go ahead and test all the other types of Kubernetes YAML. So in my example here, in my GitHub repo, I have a Kubernetes services folder with a custom service. I have a config maps folder with a config map. I have a stateful set and an ingress folder. So we can go ahead and try to test every one of these individually. So we can see our service is all good, passing all the checks. Our config map is all good. And it doesn't only have to be a deployment. I can test things like a stateful set as well as daemon sets and cron jobs. We can see here that our YAML validation passed, but our policy checks for the stateful set is failing because we don't have CPU limits requests, we don't have liveliness probes or readiness probes, and we're not setting memory requests and limits either. So Datree picks up on all these best practices using rules. Now to go back to schema validation feature, we can pass our YAML file to Datree to test for a specific schema version of Kubernetes. So in this example, I have an ingress.yaml, which is a fairly new API. If we take a look at this YAML file, this is API version networking k8s.io v1 beta. And just to showcase you what a schema version check could look like is if you pass in a schema that is unknown, Datree will give you a schema validation error back. So it will say passing 1.14 schema validation 0 out of 1, and it'll complain to say it cannot find the schema for that object you're trying to test. I also have another ingress under Kubernetes ingress. I have an ingress.yaml, and this is the old API. So you can see I have extensions v1 beta, which was deprecated in Kubernetes 1.16. If I ask Datree to test this for schema version 1.15 and I run this, you can see this time the Kubernetes schema validation passed because the schema is valid for Kubernetes 1.15. However, you can see a policy check has failed, which is letting us know that we're passing in an API version which is unsupported by Kubernetes clusters newer than 1.16. So YAML syntax errors, schema validation, and policy checks go very well hand in hand. Now Datree can also do wildcard scans on a directory. If you want to pass in more than one YAML file, I can run Datree against that entire directory by using this sort of wildcard syntax. I go ahead and run that, and that will do the same 3 features on top of all of this YAML files. Now Datree also has a very handy dashboard which we can access directly from using the command line. If we run any Datree test command, take a look at the output. So obviously it prints out all the checks, gives you a summary, and then also prints out a summary table with a URL in here that links to app.datree.io. Now basically Datree runs against a bunch of rules which are tied up to a default policy. In order to customize these policies and create our own, Datree gives us a unique session so we can use this link to log in, create an account, and customize our policies. So if I go ahead and follow this link, and then we'll get to the sign up page. So what I can do here is I can sign in, create a new account, and it will load our profile, and we are in. Now in this dashboard, we can see all our policies and the rules that are active for those policies. So all the rule output that we saw earlier when testing our YAML is part of this default policy. You can see there's 21 out of 60 active rules. And if we click this policy, we can see all the rules on the right hand side here. So here you can see some of the rules that we ran into. Now the cool thing is we can go ahead and toggle these rules on and off. So we can go ahead and enable and disable them for our account. We can also go into this rule, and we can even edit the text over here. So this is really helpful if you're maintaining some kind of team documentation where you want to describe best practices for your platform. You can put a link inside here that links to your documentation. You can also put contact details in here, so if developers sees this error, they want more explanation, they can click a link and go to your documentation, or they can contact the relevant team that can help them resolve the problem. So as you can see, we can fully customize each of these rules, and all of these changes will take effect next time we run the Datree test command. I can also go ahead and create a new policy. So we can say create policy, and let's create a policy called production. So I go ahead and save that, and now I can go ahead and select that policy, and I can go ahead and make changes to some of these rules now. So now if I want to go ahead and run my Datree test for my YAML against the production policy, I can do so by providing the flag -p and then the name of the policy. So if we run this, notice what happens. It'll run the Datree test, and it says it's passed all the YAML validation, the schema validation, as well as all the policy checks. And this is true because if we go back to the dashboard, we can see that I don't have any rules active. So when creating a new policy, you have to go ahead and add all the rules you want to be part of that policy. So I can go ahead and say I want memory requests, memory limits, liveliness probes, CPU requests and limits, and a container readiness probe. And if I run the Datree test for that policy again, it will immediately fail because it fails all those policy checks, as you can see here. Now, for those of you who don't want to necessarily manage rules and policies from a dashboard, maybe you like the idea of infrastructure as code, Datree also supports policies as code. If you head over to the documentation, go under setup and policy as code, you can enable policy as code on the settings page of your account with a simple toggle. And then you can write a policy YAML file and write Datree publish to publish those policies. Now you can take a look at an example, and this is how you can write a policy file as a YAML file. So all these policy rules that you see in the dashboard can be managed from YAML files as well. This means if you're a fan of GitOps, you can go ahead and check all these policy YAML files into a Git repo and manage them through a GitOps pipeline. And I wanted to also show you that Datree can also work with Helm as well as Customize. So not only can you just test pure YAML, you can also test Helm charts and Customize templates. So in my Kubernetes folder, I have a Helm folder with a Helm tutorial that I did. I have a Helm chart in that folder called example app. If I change directory to Kubernetes/Helm, I can run Datree test against the Helm chart, and I can even pass in custom values like a values file. We can see it runs Datree test and gives me a policy check summary out of that. Datree also has built-in native customized support. So instead of Datree test, I can run Datree customized test and point to a customized template folder. So in my Kubernetes folder, I have a customized folder with a customized application. Here's all my YAML, which is part of that customized template. If I go ahead and run Datree customized test against that application template, it'll provide all the Datree functionality and do all the policy checks against that customized template. This is all good and well, but what about our CI pipeline? What about things that go through CI/CD? Now, Datree has many CI/CD examples. Under hub.datree.io, there's a CI/CD examples section with many different types of CI/CD workflow support. So this helps us run all these rules and policy checks against our YAML and prevents our precious pipeline from running. It'll check for all these policies, and when there's any failures, it'll prevent the pipeline from continuing. So in this example, I'll take a look at a quick GitHub action workflow. So under my Kubernetes Datree folder, I have a GitHub actions example YAML. I've called it datree.yaml. If we take a look at this, this is just a simple GitHub actions workflow file where you have a trigger. So it will run on pull request and push on the Datree branch. We provide a Datree token as a secret, and it's important to understand that this token ties up all our custom policies to the account we want to use. So when we pass in a token, Datree will know which policies to use as part of the test. So that's why the token is important. Then I have the normal CI/CD stuff like jobs and steps. So we check out our source code, and you can see for the CI check, all I'm doing is running the Datree GitHub action step, and I'm giving it a path to say run against these Kubernetes files, and I'm passing Kubernetes Datree example deployment.yaml. So here you can pass in what you want Datree to test. And if we go over to my GitHub repo, we click on actions, we can see I have a GitHub action that has triggered here. This is the job name is K8 is policy check. And you can see that my policy check has prevented my CI pipeline from continuing. If I expand that and expand the command and I scroll down, we can see here we have our policy check output printed. So the developer can get all this useful information right from their CI dashboard. So from a shifting left point of view, we've gone ahead and detected all these problems on our local machine. We've then also covered our CI pipeline by detecting any misconfiguration that happens there. But what about Kubernetes deployments that bypass our CI pipeline? What about engineering teams that are installing Helm charts, customized templates, or just going kubectl apply and applying these manifests directly into the cluster? Now, not only does Datree run on our local machine and in our CI pipeline, but there's also a shiny new feature that allows us to run Datree inside of our cluster, preventing any YAML from going in where misconfiguration issues are detected. Now, Datree also ships in the form of an admission webhook controller. So we can go ahead and install Datree in our cluster, and that forms a cluster integration that allows you to validate your resources against your configured policy upon pushing them into the cluster by using an admission webhook. This webhook will catch, create, apply, and edit operations for Kubernetes. If any misconfigurations are found, the webhook will reject the operation and give you detailed output, the same output that we see in the Datree test command. Now to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and spin up a small lightweight Kubernetes cluster and take it for a spin. Now I have all the instructions that I'm about to show you as part of my GitHub repo, including a link to the GitHub repo for the admission webhook. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and spin up a small lightweight Kubernetes cluster using kind. So I'm going to say kind create cluster. I'm going to call my cluster Datree, and I'm just going to pass in Kubernetes 1.23.6 as the version of the cluster I want to use. I go ahead and run this in a new terminal. And this will go ahead and run a lightweight Kubernetes cluster in a Docker container that we can use for testing. Now, when that cluster is ready, I can go ahead and say kubectl get nodes, and we have our node up and running. And the next thing we have to go ahead and do is export our Datree token. We can grab this token from the dashboard. We go ahead to our dashboard, go to our account, go to settings. We can go to token management, and we can copy the token directly from here. So that is the place where you can manage tokens. You can create new ones, you can delete old ones. It's important to note that the token is used for Datree to identify our account and the policies that are all linked to that account. It helps us create custom policies and tells the webhook controller to use that token to access those policies. So I can run export and export an environment variable called Datree_token. So I can go ahead and copy that, paste that to the terminal, followed by the token value. Now because I'm running in a lightweight Alpine container, I'm going to have to say apk add OpenSSL. This is because the bash script used to install the webhook will use OpenSSL to generate certificates for the webhook. Now to install the webhook, it's really simple. All we do is use curl to download the webhook script, which I download locally and I call it datree.sh. When you run this command, it'll go ahead and download the script locally. You can see I have the local file on the left here. We then give it chmod +x to give it execution rights, and we use bash to run that script. You can briefly take a look at the script to see what it does, but all it basically does is it creates a Datree namespace. It verifies a few things like to make sure the webhook doesn't exist. It double checks your token. Then it goes and generates keys in a temporary directory. It creates the namespace. It sets up labels. It double checks your token. It goes ahead and creates a TLS secret for the webhook. It downloads the YAML manifest for the admission webhook and says kubectl create. And that's pretty much it. So we go ahead and change directory to the Kubernetes Datree folder and run bash datree.sh. This will go ahead and do all of that magic and install the webhook. And if we take a look at the logs here, we can see we've successfully rolled out the webhook server. We can do kubectl get ns and we can see it's created a Datree namespace. If we do in that namespace get pods, we can see it's got 2 instances of the webhook server running. Now with the webhook running, it's pretty much protecting our cluster against misconfiguration. If I try to run kubectl apply, it'll go ahead and print out the output with all the policy check information. So let's say I say kubectl apply and I try to apply that example deployment in our Kubernetes Datree folder. If I try to run that, look what happens. So automatically the policy checks are executed as soon as I say kubectl apply. You can see it does the same YAML validation, schema validation, and policy checks. Now to get this deployment into the cluster, let's go ahead and fix up the YAML file so we can pass these policies. So you can see it's going to be quite simple. There are CPU limits and requests needs to be set. There's a liveliness probe. There's memory limit and request that we need to set, as well as readiness probes. And we also should be deploying our things into a custom namespace and not use the default. So to fix up the YAML, I go into my Kubernetes Datree example folder, open my deployment.yaml, and we scroll down, we can see all that we have to do is enable the following. There's a liveliness probe here, there's a readiness probe, as well as resource limits and requests for CPU and memory. So I go ahead and uncomment these. So now our deployment should pass all the policy checks. I'm also going to go ahead and create a new namespace. So I'm going to create a namespace called examples. Go ahead and run that, and I'll deploy all my examples into this namespace. So I can now finally say kubectl kubectl apply in the examples namespace apply the deployment.yaml file. And this time we have passed all the policy checks and our deployment created successfully. So now we've covered shifting left by testing our YAML files locally, by checking everything in our CI pipeline, making sure we cover policy checks during CD and deployments. So we've checked every aspect of our Kubernetes deployment workflow end to end. But there's one problem. What about resources that are already in our cluster? Now it doesn't simply end there. Datree also has a kubectl plugin, so we can extend kubectl and add capability to allow scanning resources within your cluster for misconfiguration. And this is very easy to install. I can also download the binaries directly from the GitHub release page. So in my example, I'm going to use the v0.11 version. I'm going to say curl and grab that sh file. I'm going to download it to a temp directory. So go ahead and run that. I then give it chmod execution rights. So I'm going to run that, and I run bash to run the install script. So I go ahead and do that, and now we can see the plugin has installed successfully. So now what I can do is I can run kubectl datree test, and I can pass in a namespace. So doing this, I can actually test all the resources in a given namespace. So I'm going to run datree test against the example namespace I just created. So what this will do is go ahead and fetch all the resources as part of that namespace, and it runs the tree test against them. So you can see here we've gone ahead and done that. It's passed the YAML validation, schema validation, and all the policy checks. It also prints out the resources that were checked. So you can see in the namespace examples, we've checked for the deployment example deploy. So this covers scanning for misconfigurations within your existing cluster. So hopefully this video helps you shift left and detect problems with your Kubernetes cluster before it's too late. We detected Kubernetes misconfigurations on our local machine, as well as our CI pipeline and the CD part of the software delivery workflow, as well as things that are already in our cluster. And as you can see, Datree also plays really nicely with tools that you are already using, like Helm and Customize. There are also community-driven integrations like a VS Code plugin. Now, if you're using Datree, let me know down below what sort of misconfiguration issues you are experiencing, and let me know down below what sort of features you'd like to see Datree cover next. And if you like the video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell. And if you want to support the channel even further, be sure to check the Patreon link down below or click the join button and become a YouTube member. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.